On the afternoon of September 5, 1949, more than 72,000 spectators at Cleveland Municipal Airport watched a radically modified P-51 Mustang named begin tear around the course at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The pilot, Bill Odom, was leading the Thompson Trophy race. He had never flown a pylon race before that weekend. Odom was a renowned aviator, holding records for long-distance flights, including a round-the-world journey completed in just 73 hours and 5 minutes. Jackie Cochran, the legendary aviatrix who held more speed and altitude records than any woman alive, had purchased Begin specifically for him to race. The aircraft was stunning. Its radiator had been relocated from the belly to the wing tips, and the lower fuselage had been fared over smoothly. It looked less like a warplane and more like a racing machine built for pure velocity. On the second lap, disaster struck. Odom cut inside pylon number 3 and attempted to correct toward pylon 4. The Mustang rolled inverted, flying upside down for a terrifying instant before plunging into a house on West Street in nearby Berea, Ohio. Odom was killed instantly, along with Jean Lear and her 13-month-old son Craig. The family had only moved into the house 4 days prior. The house caught fire, and 72,000 witnesses watched in horror. Cook Cleland, flying a Goodyear F2G Super Corsair, won the race following Odom's crash. When reporters asked him about the tragedy, Cleland was forthright, saying Odom should never have been in the Thompson Trophy race at all. Odom was a Bendix pilot, a cross-country flyer. Pylon racing required a different temperament. He was skilled, but he was in the wrong event. That crash marked the end of the golden age of Cleveland air racing and pushed the Mustang into obscurity for more than a decade, yet it did not mark the end of the airplane. The P-51 Mustang, the fighter that had swept the Luftwaffe from the skies over Europe, was about to begin a second life no one could have anticipated. It would fight in Korea, serve in over 30 nations across 6 continents, cut telephone wires with its propeller over the Sinai Desert, witness the last dogfight between piston-powered aircraft in history, and 4 decades after factory closures, still fly combat missions in the Caribbean while modern jets circled overhead. This is the story of the P-51 Mustang after World War II. When the war concluded in August 1945, the United States military faced an unexpected problem: too many airplanes. North American Aviation had built over 15,000 Mustangs during the war, with the Englewood, California factory producing over 100 per week at peak. Now the assembly lines went silent. Thousands of aircraft sat in storage depots across 3 continents. The cost to maintain them exceeded their value. The solution was brutal. Crews across America and Europe began dismantling perfectly serviceable fighters with acetylene torches and dropping 18-foot steel plates from cranes to crush airframes. A teenager named Ed Maloney observed this destruction at Calero Field near Chino, California. A senior in high school with a deep passion for aviation, he had spent his childhood clipping pictures of airplanes and constructing detailed wooden models while other kids traded baseball cards. Now he watched B-17s and B-24s snap like toys as steel plates fell from cranes, cleaving fuselages in two. It was almost nauseating, he said. Later, he saw house-sized piles of aircraft manuals being set ablaze. One worker told him he could take as many as he wished. Maloney made trip after trip, salvaging documents from the flames. That experience haunted him for life. He vowed to save as many aircraft as he could. Though money was scarce, he scraped together enough to purchase old warbirds and store them. Occasionally he traded aircraft to acquire more. Soon he had a collection, but Maloney was an exception. Most Americans regarded surplus aircraft as scrap. Worn P-51 Mustangs sold at auction for as little as $1,500, less than the price of a new car. During the war, each had cost the government about $51,000. Now they sold for pennies. Some foreign governments acquired them even cheaper under the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, signed in Rio de Janeiro in September 1947. Hundreds of Mustangs were transferred for a nominal $1 each. The Swiss Air Force purchased 130 Mustangs from surplus stocks in southern Germany for approximately $4,000 apiece in December 1947, flying them until 1958 to replace pre-war machines at bargain prices. The military saw no future for the propeller fighter. Jets were the future. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star had flown in 1944 and could outpace any piston aircraft in level flight. Newly forming air forces wanted jets. The Mustangs seemed destined for scrap. Then came Korea. North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950. Within days, the Korean People's Army pushed south across the 38th parallel with Soviet-built tanks and overwhelming forces. The South Korean military collapsed. American forces stationed in Japan scrambled to respond, discovering a significant problem almost immediately. Jets were fast but could not loiter long enough to support ground troops. The P-80 Shooting Star burned fuel rapidly. Pilots barely had time to identify targets before returning to base. Round trips from Japan to Korea consumed most fuel, and jets arrived over the battlefield with only minutes to act. Early jets required long, paved runways. Most Korean airfields were short, rugged, and cratered by artillery. Jet engines ingested debris and flamed out. These advanced fighters were useless at forward bases where ground forces needed support most. The Mustang had none of these issues. It could loiter over battlefields for hours, operate from dirt strips that would destroy a jet engine, and carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, rockets, or napalm. Hundreds sat in storage across the United States, awaiting the cutting torch. The Air Force scrambled to revive them. Many were relegated to Air National Guard units. Others sat in desert storage across the American Southwest. Crews worked around the clock to restore airworthiness, loading 145 Mustangs onto the aircraft carrier USS Boxer and shipping them across the Pacific. The Boxer departed Alameda, California, on July 14 and arrived at Yokosuka, Japan, just 8 days and 7 hours later, marking the fastest trans-Pacific crossing by an aircraft carrier in history. By late July, F-51 Mustangs were back in combat. The designation had changed. In June 1948, the newly formed United States Air Force replaced P-4 Pursuit with F-4 Fighter. The P-51 became the F-51, but it remained the same aircraft. The warbird that had escorted bombers over Berlin was now diving on North Korean tanks. Lieutenant E. Helleth was a young American pilot with barely 200 hours of Mustang flight experience when he joined the Republic of Korea Air Force in those desperate first weeks. He was part of a small group of American volunteer pilots serving as advisors and combat leaders. On July 10, 1950, Helleth was flying a mission toward Shonan when he realized his radio had failed. Simultaneously, he spotted 2 North Korean tanks on a road below. Attempting to alert his flightmates, he found they could not hear him. He made a split-second decision, break from formation and attack one tank, destroying it. Following the road south, he found 9 trucks and a half-track, which he destroyed as well. By the time he landed, his aircraft was nearly out of ammunition. He spent 5 days returning to Tu by walking and hitchhiking. This exemplified the kind of warfare the Mustang faced in Korea: close air support, interdiction, and ground attack. The romantic era of high-altitude dogfighting had ended. Mustang pilots no longer hunted enemy fighters, they attacked tanks, trucks, and supply convoys. This was brutal, low-level work, and it came at a heavy cost. The Mustang's liquid-cooled Merlin engine was its Achilles heel. Unlike an air-cooled radial engine, which could endure considerable damage, the Merlin relied on a radiator filled with coolant. A single rifle bullet through that radiator could overheat the engine and seize it within minutes. There was no chance to glide to safety. Pilots had seconds to bail out or perish. Ed Schmud, the brilliant engineer who led the Mustang's design team at North American Aviation, watched in frustration from California. He later said the P-51 was designed for high-altitude fighting, to escort bombers at 25,000 feet where its supercharged Merlin engine outperformed everything in the sky. Flying it in ground support was nearly a suicide mission. A .30 caliber round through the radiator could disable the engine in 2 minutes. But the Air Force had made a catastrophic post-war decision, scrapping their P-47 Thunderbolts. The Thunderbolt was heavier and slower than the Mustang but had an air-cooled radial engine that could endure tremendous punishment, the ideal ground attack aircraft. The Navy kept its F-4U Corsairs for similar reasons. The Mustang was all the Air Force had, so the Mustang went to war. The statistics tell the story. 335 F-51 Mustangs were lost during the Korean War. 264 pilots were killed or went missing, with 172 lost to enemy ground fire. Only 10 were shot down by enemy jets. The remainder were lost to accidents or vanished without explanation. Vulnerability was worst in winter, with brutal cold and frequent icing conditions. Mustangs were not equipped with de-icing systems. Wing ice accumulated rapidly at low altitudes, and an overloaded aircraft entering a stall or spin rarely recovered. Flying under these conditions was a virtual death sentence. On the ground, conditions were equally miserable. Shelter at forward bases was primitive. Pilots and mechanics lived in tents and unheated buildings. The brutal cold drove some airmen to rig improvised heating systems using oil and 100-octane aviation fuel. The results were predictable. Fires and explosions killed men who had survived combat. Yet, the Mustang performed its mission. It could reach targets the jets could not. It could stay on station when the jets had to leave. It could operate from forward bases that the jets would never touch. North Korean troops learned to fear the sound of that Merlin engine. They feared napalm most of all. Pilots from the 51st Fighter Interceptor Squadron developed a hybrid napalm mixture with thermite that burned hot enough to melt the rubber right off tank road wheels. The punishing attacks forced North Korean forces to restrict troop movements to nighttime and to camouflage everything. Soldiers hid their vehicles under any available cover, sometimes driving tanks into houses or haystacks to escape the Mustangs circling overhead. The Royal Australian Air Force's No. 77 Squadron flew Mustangs in Korea from July 1950 through April 1951 when they converted to Gloster Meteor jets. They suffered significant casualties during that period before assisting other United Nations forces in hammering North Korean forces around Busan. The Australian Mustangs escorted American B-29 bombers on raids against enemy airfields. The South African Air Force's No. 2 Squadron flew Mustangs from November 1950 until they converted to F-86 Sabres. Their losses were heavy, 12 pilots killed in action, 30 missing. The South Africans flew as part of the United States 18th Fighter Bomber Wing and earned a reputation for professionalism under fire. The South Koreans flew Mustangs throughout the war. For them, it was not a matter of choice. They could not afford jets. The Mustang was their backbone fighter flown by pilots who were fighting for the survival of their country. Some Korean pilots were veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Services during World War II. They knew how to fly. They knew how to fight. They knew they might not come home. By 1953, the Mustang was finally being replaced by jet fighter bombers. The F-84 Thunderjet and the F-86 Sabre took over ground attack duties. The last American F-51s passed to the South Korean Air Force in January of that year. The age of the propeller fighter in American service was ending. The last American Air Force Mustang, an F-51D assigned to the West Virginia Air National Guard's 167th Fighter Bomber Squadron, was finally withdrawn from service on January 27, 1957. It was retired to what was then called the Air Force Central Museum. But for a brief moment on May 6, 1957, it was reactivated to fly at the 50th anniversary of the Air Force aerial firepower demonstration at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. One final flight for the old warrior. But in other parts of the world, the Mustang was just getting started. In the summer of 1948, a fledgling nation called Israel was fighting for its survival. The British Mandate of Palestine had ended in May. The State of Israel had declared independence. Within hours, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded. The new country had almost no air force. Its enemies flew Spitfires and Hurricanes, aircraft supplied by Britain. Israel had a hodgepodge collection of light civilian aircraft, converted for military use, and a handful of Czechoslovak-built Memoirs that were barely airworthy. Israeli agents in the United States went looking for fighters. They found 4 P-51 Mustangs for sale. The problem was that America had imposed an arms embargo on the Middle East. President Harry Truman supported humanitarian aid to Israel, but had blocked weapons sales. Exporting military aircraft was illegal. Al Schumer, a New York-born flight engineer who would later found Israel Aerospace Industries, coordinated the purchase. The Israelis did something creative. They created the Mustangs and labeled them as combines manufactured by International. Nobody asked what kind of farm equipment weighed 3 tons and came in airplane-shaped crates. The first 2 Mustangs arrived in September 1948. Mechanics worked around the clock to assemble them at a makeshift airstrip hidden among orange orchards near Herzliya. Within days, the Mustangs were flying combat missions. They immediately became the best fighters in the Israeli inventory, faster and longer range than anything the Arab armies could put in the sky. With their long range spanning the entire Middle East, the Mustangs were used for reconnaissance as well as ground attack and interception. They could reach Damascus and Cairo and return to base on a single tank of fuel. No other Israeli fighter could match that capability. On November 20, 1948, a Royal Air Force de Havilland Mosquito was conducting reconnaissance over Israel. British aircraft had been flying these missions with impunity because no Israeli fighter could reach their altitude. Earlier interception attempts had failed. That day, American volunteer pilot Wayne Peake scrambled in a Mustang from Castina Air Base. He climbed to altitude and intercepted the Mosquito. He shot it down. It was a message. The skies over Israel now belonged to Israel. On January 5, 1949, 2 days before the final ceasefire of the War of Independence, 2 Mustangs were escorting T-6 Harvard trainers pressed into service as ground attack aircraft. They encountered Egyptian fighters over the battlefield. In the dogfight that followed, the Mustangs shot down 3 of them. It was the Mustangs' last air combat action of that war. Although the War of Independence ended in early 1949, the Mustangs continued to fly. Israeli pilots conducted reconnaissance missions over neighboring Arab states for years afterward. In April 1951, 4 Mustangs and 4 Spitfires attacked Syrian positions at Al Hama after Syrian forces ambushed and killed 7 Israeli soldiers. In April 1954, when an Israeli Navy ship ran aground near Saudi Arabia, Mustangs flew cover for the rescue operation. When recovery became impossible, they bombed the ship to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. By the mid-50s, the Israeli Air Force was acquiring jet fighters. Gloster Meteors came first, then Dassault Aragons and Misters from France. The Mustang lost its frontline role. Only one squadron number 116 remained operational. Its primary mission was training new pilots. Then came October 1956 and the Suez Crisis. Israel, France, and Britain had secretly agreed to attack Egypt after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The plan called for Israel to strike first, providing Britain and France with a pretext to intervene. The Israelis pulled their Mustangs out of storage. A second squadron was formed. Given their long range, the Mustangs were tasked with destroying Egyptian aircraft at distant airfields, some beyond the Suez Canal in mainland Africa. But the Mustangs also received a special mission unlike anything the aircraft had ever attempted. On October 29, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 pairs of P-51 Mustangs raced westward across the Sinai Desert. They flew at treetop level, so low that their propellers nearly touched the sand. Their mission was to cut Egyptian telephone lines using their wings. Israeli intelligence knew that Egyptian command and control depended on landlines running through the desert. If those lines went down, Egyptian units would be unable to coordinate their defense. Radio communication was unreliable. The telephone system was the nervous system of the Egyptian army. Someone had designed a special device for the mission. It consisted of a weight connected by a cable to the aircraft's tail. The idea was to drag the weight through the telephone wires, snagging and severing them. But during the mission, some of the devices fell off. The pilots did not abort. Instead, they flew even lower and used their wings and propeller blades to slice through the wires directly. It was an act of almost suicidal bravery. At that altitude, measured in feet rather than hundreds of feet, a single mistake meant instant death. The pilots succeeded. Egyptian communications across the Sinai were severed just as Israeli paratroopers dropped at the Mittler Pass. Egyptian commanders suddenly found themselves unable to contact their forward units. The resulting confusion contributed to the rapid Israeli advance. The Mustang had found yet another use. It was no longer just a fighter or a bomber. Now it was a wire cutter. Israel kept its Mustangs in service until January 15, 1961. By then, jets had completely taken over the frontline role. But the Mustang had proven itself adaptable beyond anyone's imagination. While the Mustang was fighting wars in Asia and the Middle East, it was finding a different kind of life in America. After the war, surplus Mustangs attracted a new breed of pilot. Men who had flown them in combat wanted to fly them again, but now for sport. Air racing had existed before the war. The Thompson Trophy race at Cleveland had drawn crowds of over 100,000 during the Great Depression. But those pre-war races used specially built aircraft, tiny machines designed for nothing but speed. After 1945, the races opened to military surplus. Suddenly, ordinary civilians could buy fighters that had cost the government $50,000 for less than the price of a used car. The Mustang was perfect for racing. It was fast in a straight line. It was relatively easy to fly compared to more temperamental fighters like the Corsair, and it could be modified extensively. Racers stripped off armor and armament to save weight. They smoothed the airframe and filled every rivet hole. They tweaked the Merlin engines for more power. Some Move the radiator from the belly to the wingtips to reduce drag.
Paul Mance won
the Bendix Trophy cross-country race in 1946, flying a Mustang at 435 miles per hour.
Jackie Cochran finished second in another Mustang at 420 miles per hour. In 1948, Muntz won again and Cochran finished third.
The first three finishers that year were separated by less than 3 miles per hour.
It was the closest transcontinental race ever.
The Thompson Trophy pylon races at Cleveland showcased modified Mustangs, flying at speeds their designers had never imagined.
Modified Corsairs and Mustangs circled the course at over 400 mph, pulling tremendous G-forces in the turns.
But air racing was dangerous. In 1947, Tony Ginazzo died when carbon monoxide leaked into the cockpit of his
modified Corsair during the Thompson Trophy race.
His aircraft crashed while the race continued around him. Cleveland won that year at a record 396 miles per hour. Then came September 5, 1949 and
Bill O'Dm's fatal crash. The deaths of Odom and the Lou family ended the
Cleveland races. Organizers could not risk another disaster in a residential neighborhood.
The Civil Aeronautics
Administration threatened to ban future races.
Sponsors pulled out.
From 1950 onward, surplus military aircraft were banned from competition.
The Mustang racers were grounded.
The airplanes that had dominated the post-war racing scene sat in hangars and on tie-down lines, waiting for something that
might never come.
They would not fly competitively again for 15 years.
In 1964, a boat racing champion named Bill Steed decided to revive air racing in the Nevada desert near Reno. Steed was a showman and a businessman. He secured a contract with ABC Television's Wide World of Sports.
He convinced casino owners in nearby Reno that air races
would attract tourists.
He found a small airport called Sky Ranch on a plateau about 5,000 feet above sea level,
surrounded by mountains and far from any residential neighborhoods.
The Mustangs came out of storage. Pilots who had kept their warbirds alive through the lean years suddenly had a reason to fly them again.
A new generation of young pilots,
too young to have fought in the war, discovered the thrill of racing aircraft their fathers had flown into combat. Modified Mustangs with names like Saga, Voodoo, and Red became legends of Reno. They regularly exceeded
450 miles per hour, faster than the aircraft had ever flown during the war. The Reno
races became the premier air racing event in the world, attracting hundreds of thousands of spectators every
September.
The racing circuit continues to this day. Mustangs remain among the most competitive aircraft in the
unlimited class.
The competition has pushed modification beyond anything the original designers imagined.
Racing
Mustangs run engines producing over 3,000 horsepower, nearly double the wartime rating.
Some have clipped wings for better roll rate. Others have stretched fuselages and modified cooling systems. Some of these machines have
been flying for 80 years. They have outlived their designers, their original pilots, and most of the nations they once served. Every year at Reno, they prove that the Mustang's performance envelope has not yet been fully explored. But the racing circuit was only part of the story. In the 1950s and 60s, the P-51 remained a frontline fighter in dozens of air forces around the world. The Philippines acquired over
100 Mustangs after World War II.
They became the backbone of the post-war Philippine Army Air Corps and later the
Philippine Air Force. Filipino pilots flew Mustangs against communist hook insurgents during the emergency of the
late 40s and early 50s. They also used them against Moraro rebels in southern Philippines.
The Mustang was the first
aircraft of the Philippine Air Demonstration Team formed in 1953 and
named the Blue Diamonds.
The following year, Indonesia acquired Mustangs from
the departing Netherlands East Indies Air Force in 1949 and 50. Later they received more from the United States. Indonesian Mustangs flew against numerous rebellions during the 50s, including the CIA-backed Permesta rebels in 1958. On May 18, 1958, an Indonesian Mustang scored what remains the only confirmed aerial victory in the history of the Indonesian Air Force. Captain Ignatius Dwanto was flying a
P-51D when he encountered a B-26 Invader over the Malin Islands near Ambon. The Invader was being flown by Alan Lawrence Pope, an American CIA contract pilot supporting the Pomesta Rebellion.
Duanto shot him down.
Pope survived, was captured, sentenced to death, and
eventually released in 1962. Guatemala operated 30 Mustangs from 1954. Into the early 1970s, Haiti had 4 Mustangs during the rule of President Paul Eugene Manquire from 1950 to 1956.
The last Haitian Mustangs were retired in 1973 or 74 and sold for spare parts.
Sweden operated over 160 Mustangs designated J-26. Some were modified for photo reconnaissance and designated S-26.
These aircraft participated in secret Swedish mapping missions of Soviet military installations along the Baltic coast in 1946 and 47.
The operation, C-named Fallon, involved deliberate violations of Soviet airspace. The Mustang could outdive any Soviet fighter
of that era, so none were lost during these missions.
The Chinese Nationalist Air Force flew Mustangs against the Communists during the Chinese Civil War. When the Nationalists retreated to Taiwan in 1949, their Mustangs went with them.
The Communist Chinese captured 39 Mustangs left behind on the mainland.
In October 1949, 9 of those Mustangs flew in the military parade celebrating the founding of the People's Republic of China. Mao watched American-built fighters fly overhead in communist markings.
But the most remarkable Mustang operator was the Dominican Republic.
The Fuerza Aérea Dominicana received its first Mustangs on September 29, 1948.
The initial aircraft were flown by Brazilian mercenaries, veterans of World War II, who trained
over 100 Dominican pilots between 1948 and 1950. Over the next few years, the Dominicans acquired more Mustangs, including 32X Swedish F-51DS, purchased in 1952 and 53. These Mustangs formed the backbone of Dominican air power for over 3 decades.
They were among the most colorfully painted fighters in the world, with bright schemes in shark-mouth nose art that made them look like aerial predators.
Dominican Mustangs saw action during the Constanza invasion of 1959 when exiles
attempted to overthrow the Trujillo dictatorship.
They flew again during the April
Revolution of 1965 when civil war erupted and American forces intervened.
During Operation Power Pack, the American intervention in the Dominican Republic, a Mustang was shot down.
It was the last Mustang ever destroyed in battle, but the Dominicans kept flying them. When their de Havilland Vampire jets wore out in the 1970s and were not replaced, the Mustangs became the only armed fighters in the Dominican
inventory. The colorful paint schemes gave way to camouflage. The shark mouths remained.
In 1983, a Cuban intelligence ship refused to leave Dominican waters.
Despite repeated warnings, the Dominican Air Force responded with its Mustangs.
They strafed the ship until it departed.
Cuba retaliated by sending MiG-21 jets to buzz Dominican air bases. The Mustang pilots knew better than to fight supersonic jets with propeller fighters. As one pilot later recalled, they went inside and hid until the MiGs went away. The humiliation convinced the Dominican government to request American assistance.
The United States eventually provided a 37 Dragonfly attack jets.
The Dragonflies would take over the ground attack and counterinsurgency role. The Dominican Mustangs were finally retired. In 1984, 40 years after the aircraft's operational debut, 9 of the surviving aircraft were sold back to American collectors. They had outlasted every other Mustang operator in the world.
But before the Dominicans retired their Mustangs, the aircraft had one more war to fight.
July 1969.
The United States was about to land men on the moon. In Vietnam, American jet fighters clashed with Soviet-designed MiGs at supersonic speed, with Phantoms and MiG-21s dueling above the jungle using radar-guided missiles, making the propeller-driven fighter seem like relics from another age. Yet in Central America a very different kind of conflict was taking shape, as El Salvador and Honduras had argued for years over land ownership and immigration, with El Salvador being small and densely populated while Honduras was larger but thinly settled, prompting hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans to migrate into Honduras in search of work on banana plantations and farmland, only for Honduran land reforms during the 1960s to dispossess many of these immigrants and force them back across the border, creating tensions that smoldered for years until the spark was struck during the 1970 World Cup qualifying matches, where both nations were placed in the same group and games played in June. 1969 ignited riots in both countries, with fans fighting in the stands and violence spilling into the streets, and after El Salvador won the deciding match 3-2 on June 26, diplomatic relations were severed, leading El Salvador to invade Honduras on July 14, 1969. Both sides deployed air forces from a bygone era, with Honduras flying F-4U Corsairs, the bent-wing U.S. Navy fighters of World War II, operating roughly 17 aircraft consisting of F-4U-4S and F-4U-5S, while El Salvador fielded Corsairs of its own, Goodyear-built FG-1Ds, along with a small contingent of Cavalier Mustang II aircraft, which were modernized P-51Ds upgraded by the Cavalier Aircraft Corporation in Florida with improved engines, updated avionics, and wingtip fuel tanks for extended range, 5 of which had been purchased by El Salvador along with a dual-control trainer just the year before. The conflict that followed became the last war in which piston-engine fighters engaged one another in aerial combat, beginning with an almost farcical opening strike when a Salvadoran C-47 transport, never intended as a bomber, flew over the Honduran airbase at Toncontín on the evening of July 14 and crewmen manually rolled 100-pound bombs out of the cargo door in an attempt to destroy aircraft parked in the open, missing entirely, though the fighting quickly escalated as both air forces flew ground attack missions against enemy troops and infrastructure, with Mustangs and Corsairs strafing and bombing using rockets, napalm, and machine gun fire. On July 17, 1969, Captain Fernando Soto of the Honduran Air Force took off on his fourth mission of the day flying an F-4U-5 Corsair armed with 20mm cannons to support Honduran troops resisting the invasion, and as Soto and his 2 wingmen approached the combat zone he ordered a weapons check, at which point Captain Zapata reported his cannons had jammed, prompting Soto to send him back to base. But as Zapata flew alone he was spotted by 2 Salvadoran Cavalier Mustangs flown by Captains Douglas Varela and Leonel Lovo, who dove to attack in disbelief at finding a seemingly defenseless Corsair, with Varela lining up for the kill as Zapata hurled his aircraft into desperate evasive maneuvers, Varela firing his .50 caliber machine guns and missing while Zapata radioed frantically for help, which Soto heard, causing him and Captain Aosta to jettison their bombs and dive to the rescue, catching Varela from behind as he focused on Zapata, Soto opening fire with his cannons and shredding the Mustang, which went down, after which Lovo attempted to flee only to be chased down and destroyed as well, giving Soto 2 kills in minutes. The action continued when Soto and Aosta resumed their original mission and encountered 2 Salvadoran FG-1D Corsairs returning from a sortie, both of which Soto shot down, giving him 3 confirmed aerial victories that day, 1 Mustang and 2 Corsairs, the final kills ever recorded between propeller-driven fighters in combat, with his F-4U-5, number 609, now preserved at the Honduran Air Museum bearing 3 victory markings beneath the cockpit, while the war itself ended the next day through a ceasefire brokered by the Organization of American States after roughly 100 hours of fighting that left more than 3,000 dead and tens of thousands displaced, earning the conflict a permanent place in aviation history as Corsairs fought Mustangs, propeller against propeller, a final replay of World War II air combat over Central American jungles 24 years after the Great War had ended. After 1969 the P-51 Mustang's combat career was finally finished, yet the aircraft itself endured, beginning with Ed Maloney, the teenager who had watched Mustangs being cut apart at Calero Field in 1945 and vowed to save them, spending years working odd jobs and scraping together money to buy warbirds one by one, sometimes trading for rarer or more historically important aircraft, opening his collection to the public on January 12, 1957 as the first aviation museum west of the Rockies, relocating several times before partnering in 1970 with car collector Jim Brucker to display aircraft alongside classic automobiles at Movie World Cars of the Stars and Planes of Fame in Buena Park, California, a short-lived venture whose name endured, and by 1973 Maloney had secured a permanent home at Chino Airport, the same field where he had once watched aircraft being destroyed, now surrounded by civilian aviation. As volunteers gathered to restore planes to flying condition, Maloney was part of a broader movement across America as former pilots and mechanics rescued Mustangs from scrapyards, foreign air forces, and storage fields, locating aircraft in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic, rebuilding wrecks from crash sites worldwide, relearning how to maintain Merlin engines long out of production, and fostering a global warbird restoration community with specialized shops in the United States, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, while parts suppliers tracked down originals or manufactured replacements to original specifications, driving values upward from $30,000 in the 1960s to over $100,000 by the 1980s and today between $2 and $4 million for airworthy examples. With historically documented aircraft exceeding $5 million, more than 160 Mustangs now flying worldwide and over 200 registered in the United States, appearing at airshows from Oshkosh to Wanaka, racing at Reno, starring in films, and even being flown by Tom Cruise, whose Mustang appeared in Top Gun: Maverick in 2022, bearing the names and markings of wartime pilots in units such as Cripes and Mighty, Sierra Sioux 2, and Man-O-War, the checker-tailed Tuskegee Airmen, the red-nosed 4th Fighter Group, and the blue-striped 357th, with restored cockpits featuring armor plating, deactivated guns, period radios alongside modern avionics, all in pursuit of authenticity. In 2014, Sierra Sioux 2 completed a 3-year restoration by Air Corps Aviation in Minnesota, confirmed to retain nearly all original 1944 components from North American's Englewood factory, making it the most original P-51D still flying, earning major awards at Oshkosh. While in 2013 Doug Matthews set a piston engine altitude record of 42,568 feet in the Mustang the Rebel, nearly 70 years old at the time and still flawless, a record that stands today, as Maloney himself passed away on August 19, 2016, National Aviation Day, after dedicating his life to preserving warbirds, leaving behind a museum with more than 50 aircraft, many airworthy, carried forward by his family and pilots like his son-in-law Steve Hinton and grandson Stephen Hinton Jr., a 7-time Reno Gold champion. The Mustang story began with a 102-day design effort in 1940, evolved through the transformative Merlin engine, escorted bombers to Berlin and Tokyo, destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft, reinvented itself repeatedly after the war, and today survives because people refused to let it disappear. Preservationists, pilots, restorers, and collectors who keep Merlin engines turning. So although the Englewood factory closed in 1945 and no new Mustangs were built, the sound of those 12 cylinders at full power still echoes across skies from California to New Zealand, transforming the P-51 Mustang from an airplane into a lasting symbol of an era that refuses to fade. And if you found this story compelling, please like the video, subscribe to help share forgotten World War II histories, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.